Well, had there been a proper question there, I might try to answer it. Euroscepticism is growing right across the European Union. Nobody here, not even the maniacs that believe in the project, would question that. It's coming in all shapes and forms. It's on the right, it's in the centre, and it's on the left. And the reason, of course, and you come from Ireland, so you should know better than anybody, the reason, of course, is that actually no one's ever given consent for a political European Union. The French clearly, followed by the Dutch, rejected the Constitution, and they rebranded it as the Lisbon Treaty, and only one country had a referendum on that. That was Ireland, and the people of Ireland rejected it. So you can't tell me there is popular support for a United States of Europe. Mrs Redding may believe it, Mr Barroso may believe it, one or two in the front row may believe it, but the peoples of Europe don't believe it.
Summarizing the report and giving it to policymakers from this. So let me just read you, because some of it's a little bit funny. And again, when I say it's funny, I don't mean it's like memoirs of George Carlin. I mean it's as funny as a Eurostat report on the Greek government's financial dealings could possibly be, full of mirth. Okay, so they say, during our March 2010 methodological visit, it became evident that the Greek authorities had reported until then only very small amounts for debt guaranteed by government under repeated calls and not yet assumed by government. Amounts of around 100 million euro had been reported, compared with a correct amount of around 11 billion euro. All right? That's not a rounding error. All right? That's kind of a big deal. All right? So again, for people who don't get so part of what happened is when the Greek government is, reporting to these authorities to like, oh yeah, let us start using the euro, they were like putting down their liabilities or reporting them, and so part of it is, it wasn't actual cash going out the door, but they were guaranteeing certain types of debt. And the point is, they were saying, yeah, we're on the hook for about 100 million euro, and actually Eurostat comes in and says, actually, after further review, it's more like 11 billion. All right, so that's just one example. Now here's a typical passage of this. Like I said, the whole thing is like 20 pages long, but I was going through it, and this is something that was typical. So I'll try to just read you enough so you get the joke. Okay, so they say, during the March 2010 methodological visit, Eurostat was informed that the 2009 data in the EDP table 2C were derived from a short survey sent to local governments. The table showed a significantly increased surplus of local governments in 2009 compared to any of the previous years included in the EDP notification. Okay, so what Eurostat is saying is that, in 2010, March 2020, we went to the Greek authorities and we said, this number seems too optimistic. You're saying all these local governments had this big surplus. Where'd you get that number from? All right, and that's what they were trying to figure out, because the number was way too big compared to historical reports of that same number. Eurostat expressed its concerns about this figure, particularly as in the past it had observed downward revisions to the local government surplus in successive EDP notifications. Okay, so they're saying, not only is this a big number, but in the past you always give us a big number and then later you revise it down. So are you sure this number's right? Where'd this come from? So a month later they go back to get the answer. During the April 2010 survey round, Eurostat was informed by the Greek authorities that while the information for these years was based on the results of the census, data for 08 and 09 were calculated by using indices on the basis of information derived from the short survey. It was also mentioned that this information was provisional, as most of the municipalities were not able to provide finalized information earlier than October. Oh, okay, so they didn't have the data, so they used, the earlier. Okay, but just when were those surveys done? Concerning the data for municipal enterprises, Eurostat was informed that the reported data were based on an old survey conducted in 2002. And again, for those of you who have been dozing off or looking at your BlackBerry, the point is this was in numbers that were reported in 09 for the previous year, and Eurostat's raising eyebrows, and they say, oh yeah, that was actually based on something that was done in 2002, okay? And again, these numbers were well above historical trend and helped minimize how bad things looked, because they were saying, oh, we got these local surpluses. And the people in 2002 knew that was going to be necessary 6 years later. Okay, as far as the people who like to bring up Goldman Sachs and everything, any of these scandals, Goldman Sachs is always there on the scene. Wherever there's corruption, we'll be there. So here, what they did, let me just see how we're doing on time. Okay. What happened here is, and this was, the press picked up on this, so there's all sorts of things that the Greek government was doing to minimize how bad its books were, okay? But the point is, they never satisfied these convergence criteria. They never should have been allowed into it, And that's what I'm saying, that this wasn't just some honest mistake. I mean, the people who were administering this system knew full well that they were going to come in. And then we can talk later about, well, why would they do that? Why would they let these people come in if they were violating the rules? But clearly, people, shady stuff is going on. I think they were just surprised at how shady it was when the true facts came to light. But one of the things, so this was by no means the only thing, but one of the tricks was that Goldman Sachs when was this? I think it was in 2001. I'm not sure about that. They came in and they let the Greek government engage in a currency swap. And what happened is that it was basically, economically speaking, it was like a loan of 2.8 billion euros at the time. But that didn't get reported, right? So what happened is Goldman allowed the Greek government to basically get a loan from foreign banks of $2.8 billion without having to report any of that in terms of their liabilities. And the way they did that was because the rules for reporting to Eurostat at the time, financial derivatives you didn't have to report that stuff. And the reason, there was a rationale for that, because normally, if you're just going to hedge yourself, you're engaging in foreign transactions, you're just doing a currency swap. At the moment that you enter the arrangement where you're promising to give euros against dollars down the road or whatever the thing is, where the details are, you use the futures markets and so on to make it have a net value of zero as the moment when you enter into it, right? So the market value of that thing is zero. Now, if it moves against you down the road, then it can go against you or it can move in your favor. But the point is, the moment of entering into it, if you're using the appropriate market forecasts and so on in the futures markets, it doesn't have a net market value. So that's why you wouldn't report that as a liability. So how was it that Goldman allowed them to effectively get a loan of $2.8 billion? It's because they put in a bogus exchange rate, right? So they let the Greek government promise to give one currency in the future in exchange for another one, when at the time that they agreed to that, they were on the hook for $2.8 billion if things turned out the way everyone thought they would turn out. Okay, so that was the loophole they used. So that's just one example. And then just to finish that, let's see. So then in August of 2000, so at the time, it allowed the Greek government to push back that obligation to the year 2019. Then as things started getting uncomfortable, they wanted a little bit more wiggle room. So in August of 2005, an interest rate swap contract was restructured, pushing the maturity from 2019 back to 2037. All right, and then also Goldman, God bless them, sold its rights and obligations to the National Bank of Greece for the then market value of the swap, and then it was estimated that Goldman earned about $300 million from the deal. All right, so that's why a lot of people at the time were outraged at Goldman Sachs, because they were saying, Goldman knew it was helping the Greek authorities evade the requirements for being part of the Eurozone, and yet, Goldman was just serving its client and earning $300 million. Okay. Now, at the end of that report, that Eurostat report, just to summarize, so it's this thing, the other stuff I mentioned, and a host of other things that aren't as funny. What's the big ticket result? It said, based on the information that Eurostat compiled in the few months when it kept interviewing them, in 2009, based on what the Greek government originally said its debt was compared to now what Eurostat thought the more accurate figure was, they thought the government was understating its debt by about 24.6 billion euros, which was about 10.5% of Greek GDP. Okay, so again, these aren't these little rounding errors. That the Greek authorities, as of 2009, were reporting that their debt to GDP ratio was about 10.5 points below what it really was. So you can look at it two ways. On the one hand, you can say that the authorities were that dumb that they allowed that to happen. That they were misled that much, which isn't good, and that just shows that the system is crazy if it's that vulnerable to some government lying. Or you can say that they kind of knew that this was going on and they didn't really care. So why wouldn't they care? Why would they let them lie with impunity and so forth? Because, if anybody is bothered by lying, it's people in government. They really just take offense at that kind of stuff, a dishonesty per se. But if you start thinking, well, no, because what happens there is banks make loans to governments, and then if they think that, if trouble arises, they're going to get bailed out by the ECB, for example, or the taxpayers in stronger countries like Germany and so forth, well, then it's okay. You want to, just like what happened here in the mortgage crisis, some people say, well, that doesn't make any sense. Why would all these banks make these terrible loans? I mean, how could they have been so dumb as to, yeah, I mean, we know that they're not moral, but are they that stupid too? And then when you look at the incentives and realize, well, that no, actually a lot of these people didn't suffer. They made these loans to people they knew couldn't pay them off because they got them off the books and earned their commission and so on, and they weren't the ones left holding the bag. It's the same thing here, where the people, lending this amount of money to the Greek authorities and so forth, they knew full well that they weren't as shipshape as they were maintaining, but they thought ultimately, no, it's fine because they're not going to let the euro collapse. If this ever came to a crisis, we're going to get bailed out because all the effort they put into this, all the rhetoric of unification, and isn't this great, and we're not going to have another world war because now we're a unified Europe. They're not going to throw all that away just for a few $1 billion in bad loans. We're going to get paid off. So just to be clear, I don't think anybody realized how bad things would get. Just like when people were, lending money to people who they knew didn't have a job and to buy houses, I don't think anyone realized how bad things would be in 2008. But the point is, this was not just an honest mistake. You have to look at the incentives that people were facing. Okay, let's move on now in the last few minutes I have here, right? Because we ended, yeah. So, as far as things that are just a little bit funny, one other thing before I get into the three leaders here. So I was talking to, some of you may know this guy, Robert Wenzel, about this stuff, and he's a financial blogger. Economicpolicyjournal.com is where I go. Like when I want to find someone who's more conspiracy-minded than I am, that's where I go. And I was talking to him about this stuff, and I always imagine that when we're talking on the phone, the FBI's listening, and they're like, no, that's not what we're doing, guys. Oh, you're getting warm with that one. Yeah, that's good. So part of what right now, what's happening is, the U.S. authorities, in conjunction with other governments, are sort of putting the screws on the Iranian central bank, and so they're telling other central banks around the world, if you have any dealings with Iran in terms of their oil exports, we're going to penalize you. So again, just in terms of political economy, put aside all the stuff about business cycle theory and inflation and all that, just one reason why having a bunch of central banks is a bad idea is that it makes it more likely we're going to go to war, because then now all these transactions are funneled through these few big organizations, and so now it gives whoever's running the show at the time, the dominant military power, it's easier for it to lean on everybody else, whereas it would be kind of hard to tell each individual commercial bank around the world, if we catch you dealing with this guy, we're going to sanction you. That would be harder to police than to just look at a handful of central banks around the world and say, if we ever catch anything going through you dealing with this rogue group, then we're going to sanction your whole operation. So that's just one other illustration. Okay, but in the few minutes I have left, let me just show you why these some people, when they look at what's happening in Europe, they will say that, oh yeah, it's the bankers are cleaning house and they're installing people that are going to serve them. So here, all I'm going to do is just read you things from Wikipedia or mainstream news articles. This doesn't prove that there's anything untoward going on, but there does seem to be a pattern. Okay, so three countries that obviously were in trouble: Spain, Greece, and Italy. So let me just quickly explain. And they all recently had their heads of government replaced with somebody else. And just the pattern seems to be that the people that were put in position are probably not the worst mortal enemies of Goldman Sachs. So let me just explain some of this. So in Spain, and again, for the foreign viewers, I'm just going to butcher these names, I apologize. So it's Jose Luis Rodriguez Zapatero. His party got crushed in the elections, the previous Spanish prime minister, so he resigned on December 21st, just a few weeks ago. He was replaced by Mariano, and I don't know if it's Rajoy or Rajoy, I don't know if it's a silent J, I'm sorry. So this guy, now he actually isn't an economist himself, but he named his Minister of Economy as Luis de Guindos, and this guy has a PhD in economics from a university in Madrid. Between 2006 and 2008, he was the CEO of Lehman Brothers for Spain and Portugal, and in 2009, he worked as senior partner at PricewaterhouseCoopers. Okay, so he's probably not the poster child of Occupy Wall Street, this guy. Okay, but all right, but what do you expect, Bob? There's a financial crisis. Of course, the incoming, prime minister of Spain is going to appoint a guy who knows the financial markets. That's not a big, okay, fair enough. Greece, the previous prime minister was George Papandreou. He resigned on November 11th, okay, just a couple months ago. He was replaced by Lucas Papademos. Now, Papademos himself is the economist. So here I'm talking about the new Greek prime minister. I'm not talking about somebody he appointed. I'm talking about this is the prime minister now, the guy who's running the show. He has a doctorate in economics from MIT. He taught economics at Columbia from 75 to 84, and then it was the university.